Buongiorno, sono Elisabeth e sono una delle volontarie di BergamoScienza. La conferenza della 22esima edizione di BergamoScienza sono rese accessibili a persone con disabilità motorie e sensoriali, cercando di garantire luoghi privi di barriere architettoniche e grazie ai servizi di traduzione LIS. Tutte le conferenze sono videoregistrate, alcune delle quali trasmesse anche in diretta streaming. Le conferenze, con ospiti stranieri, prevedono la traduzione simultanea. Le registrazioni verranno pubblicate sui nostri canali ufficiali a termine del festival. Questi servizi sono resi disponibili grazie a Fondazione della Comunità Bergamasca e Fondazione Banca Popolare di Bergamo, che insieme a BergamoScienza sono impegnati a promuovere inclusione e accessibilità. Per la traduzione simultanea è sufficiente scannerizzare il QR code che vi possono fornire i volontari in sala o che trovate proiettato alle mie spalle. Il QR code vi indirizzerà direttamente a Converso Web App, dove potrete selezionare la lingua di interpretariato dal menu a tendina. Per l'ascolto della traduzione è necessaria una coppia di auricolari. Vi chiediamo la cortesia di utilizzare le vostre. Chi ne fosse momentaneamente sprovvisto può chiedere ai volontari in sala. Vi do il benvenuto all'evento di questa mattina, intitolato Come si scrive la storia dell'ignoranza. Avremo il piacere di ospitare come relatore Peter Burke dall'Università di Cambridge. La conferenza sarà moderata da Telmo Pievani dall'Associazione di BergamoScienza. Vi preghiamo di silenziare i vostri apparecchi elettronici e di partecipare numerosi alle iniziative di BergamoScienza. Grazie per l'attenzione e buon ascolto.
Grazie. Grazie, benvenute e benvenuti a tutti a questo incontro che vi presento adesso brevemente prima di dare la parola al nostro ospite. Graditissimo e straordinario di questa mattina. Peter Burke è un grandissimo storico, storico delle culture e storico sociale, e quindi ha scritto opere fondamentali su, per esempio, il significato sociale e culturale delle immagini. In particolare è un grande esperto di età moderna e di Rinascimento, quindi ama e ovviamente conosce molto bene anche la storia del nostro paese. Ha lavorato a Cambridge per tanto tempo, dove ancora è professore onorario di storia culturale, Cultural History, ed è uno dei membri più importanti della British Academy, quindi avete davanti a voi una delle grandi autorità, diciamo, della storia, della storiografia europea. Perché abbiamo pensato di invitarlo a questa edizione di BergamoScienza dedicata alle intelligenze? Perché sorprendentemente, l'ultimo suo lavoro, dico sorprendentemente perché anch'io quando l'ho visto in inglese, quando è uscito 3 anni fa, sono rimasto molto colpito, riguarda l'ignoranza, cioè quello che noi non sappiamo. Io quando l'ho visto ho detto, questo è il libro che avrei voluto scrivere io, perché è un'idea molto molto bella, che lui affronta in chiave storiografica, ma ci sono anche alcuni capitoli dedicati alla scienza, magari ne parleremo dopo. Perché alcune delle tesi che Burke sostiene in questo testo è che non è detto che quella visione della storia, della storiografia progressista o progressionista, come sarebbe più corretto dire, possa reggere ancora. Quindi l'idea che una nuova età supera la precedente perché è meno ignorante, perché sa di più. Tant'è vero che sempre una nuova epoca definisce quelle precedenti come più ignoranti, meno dotate di conoscenza. Invece lui spiega, argomenta, adesso lo ascolteremo, che in realtà nuove conoscenze che si acquisiscono naturalmente con il progresso della nostra vita, delle conoscenze, delle indagini, in realtà possono generare anche nuove ignoranze. Ignoranze al plurale, perché in questo libro parla di tante ignoranze diverse, non ce n'è soltanto una. C'è una famosa distinzione che fece qualche tempo fa uno degli editor di Nature, ormai 15 anni fa, a proposito di una dichiarazione di Rumsfeld, che era un segretario degli Stati Uniti di George Bush durante la guerra in Iraq, che rispose durante un'interrogazione davanti alla Camera, quando gli chiesero ma c'erano o non c'erano allora poi queste armi di distruzione di massa in Iraq, no? Sapete tutta quella questione che generò la guerra. E Non sappiamo bene perché, ma Ransfield, che diciamo non brilla nel ricordo per essere una mente eccelsa, però in realtà diede una risposta straordinaria perché disse, sapete, ci sono cose che noi sappiamo di sapere e quelle va bene. Poi ci sono cose che noi sappiamo di non sapere, quindi è un'ignoranza consapevole. Poi però ci sono cose che noi non sappiamo di non sapere. Ecco, io sulle armi di distruzione di massa non sapevo di non sapere. Nessuno ha capito esattamente cosa volesse dire con questa risposta, però in realtà è geniale perché introduce una tassonomia molto significativa su il sapere di non sapere, eccetera. Karl Popper, grande filosofo della scienza, trattò molto il tema dell'ignoranza da studioso del metodo scientifico e fece una famosa distinzione tra l'ignoranza, e questa per me vale molto anche sull'oggi, pensate ai social network. C'è un'ignoranza cattiva e un'ignoranza buona, o attiva e passiva, dipende da come le definite. L'ignoranza cattiva, diceva Popper, è quella di chi presume di sapere ed è pieno di certezze nella sua testa. Uno che pensa di sapere, presume troppo, quello è il vero ignorante, dice Popper. E poi c'è un'ignoranza buona, invece, che è quella generativa, di chi capisce che ha dei limiti della sua conoscenza e quindi continua a farsi domande, mette in discussione i suoi presupposti, esercita uno scetticismo razionale. Quella è un'ignoranza positiva, propositiva. Quindi adesso diamo la parola molto volentieri a Peter. Ovviamente capite che questo è un tema importante anche per la scienza, no? Che ha sempre a che fare con l'ignoto, con quello che non sappiamo. E molto spesso, pensate a quello che è successo in fisica con la materia oscura, l'energia oscura, ma pensate anche nel mio campo di studi. 15 anni fa nessuno avrebbe nemmeno immaginato che avremmo scoperto l'esistenza di 5-6 specie umane vissute fino a poche decine di migliaia di anni fa. Eravamo ignoranti e non sapevamo di essere, non sapevamo di non sapere. Poi nuove conoscenze ci hanno aperto nuovi sviluppi, sappiamo di più, ma più sappiamo, più si generano nuove domande, che è uno degli aspetti più belli dell'impresa scientifica, no? Come l'ha detto una volta un grande evoluzionista, la scienza è un'impresa conoscitiva in cui sai sempre di più e più sai, più nascono nuove domande e ti accorgi di quanto ancora non sai. E io penso che, magari ne parleremo tra poco, questo sia un vero antidoto contro ogni forma di autoritarismo, di totalitarismo, no? Di prepotenza, perché è proprio l'idea che la scienza si basa sul dubbio, sul confronto tra ipotesi e sulla consapevolezza dei limiti della conoscenza. Smetto qua, io ringrazio tantissimo Peter Burke, adesso lui ci farà una sua presentazione di questa sua ricerca su quello che non sappiamo o pensiamo di non sapere, e poi ci sarà tempo per le domande e io lo aiuterò anche nella traduzione in modo da facilitare poi la conversazione tra di noi. Peter, thank you for being with us today, and now the word is for you, and thanks again for being a BergamoScienza.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Telmo, for the generous introduction. As you will have gathered, not long ago I published a book called A History of Ignorance, a choice of topic that has caused quite some surprise. So I'd like to begin by trying to explain why on earth I should have done this. What was the point of this project? Now, since the 1990s, a new kind of history has been flourishing, the history of knowledge. Actually, it's better described as the history of knowledges in the plural, a history of different kinds of knowledge, intellectual and practical. The knowledges studied by historians today range extremely widely, from the knowledge of plumbers and gardeners to the knowledge of diplomats and prime ministers. And social historians of knowledge, and I count myself as one of them, we are inspired by the work of Karl Mannheim, Hungarian sociologist, active 100 years ago, who more or less invented what he called the sociology of knowledge, which meant asking the question, who knew what in different places, in different periods and, as Mannheim liked to emphasize, different situations. So, my own contributions to this field may illustrate the kind of thing that is being written and published today. One of my books is concerned with exiles. That is, in what ways did exiles make a distinctive contribution to knowledge because they had been displaced from their own country and were living and making a living elsewhere. Another book of mine focuses on polymaths, that is, individuals who mastered a range of disciplines. They were known in the 18th century as monsters of erudition. And once again, the question that really interested me was whether or not these polymaths could make a particular contribution to knowledge, an original contribution, which was the result of their having studied so widely. For example, they could focus on problems that fell down into the space between different academic disciplines. Or they could make use of the approaches and the concepts of one discipline to solve problems in another one. So for a number of years, I was trying to write on the history of knowledge. But after a certain number of years, one begins to feel one might be going a bit stale. It would be nice to have a fresh look at the problem. I discovered more than once in the past that a good way to take a fresh look at a problem is to attempt to turn it upside down. So why not move from the study of knowledge to the study of ignorance? And so that's what I decided to do. And once again, the problem was to write a social history. That is, to ask the question, who was ignorant of what, when, where, in what situations? And at this point, I should confess that I had intended to call the book Ignorance, a Social History. But at the last moment, the publishers in Britain decided to change the title to A Global History. And as often happens, I began research under the illusion that I was the only person, the first person, to attempt this approach. And once again, as this always happens, I discovered that a group of people, some sociologists, some anthropologists, some economists, they had been thinking along similar lines. Indeed, there were enough scholars by the year 2016 to publish in English a book called A Handbook to Ignorant Studies. So when I began, I had no idea there was something in academic circles already known as ignorant studies. So I looked at the book, which had 51 different authors. There was one historian of science in the group, but there was no plain or general or cultural historian of my kind. And I thought it was high time that plain historians too participated in this collective project. So the first thing I learned was, just as in the case of knowledge, that it's better to talk about knowledges in the plural. Similarly, in the case of ignorance, this is a term better used in the plural. There are many varieties of ignorance. if I listed all the adjectives that have been used to qualify kinds of ignorance, there would not be time for the rest of the lecture, but I just give you 2 or 3 examples. Ignorance may be conscious, but very often it's unconscious. Socrates was extremely aware of his ignorance. Most of us are only dimly aware of all that we don't know. When we think about ignorance, the first examples that come to mind are what I would call simple ignorance. For example, I happen not to know what the name of the capital of Madagascar is. Do you? But other kinds of ignorance are more serious. One kind of ignorance is focused. You find this a lot in natural science. Scientists become extremely aware that there's something precise that they don't know, that they want to know. And having identified it, they can then conduct the research, experiments, or whatever's necessary. For this reason, one scientist, a recent Nobel Prize winner, described ignorance as a resource. And as he told the audience at the prize-giving ceremony, the great thing about this resource, it's never going to run out. Another scientist wrote a book with a catchy title, Ignorance, How It Drives Science. Yet another distinction that's important is between culpable ignorance and ignorance which is blameless. In the Middle Ages, theologians liked to use the term invincible ignorance, by which they meant ignorance that was inevitable, so you couldn't help it. And their favorite example was, nobody can blame Aristotle for not being a Christian because of the simple fact he was born long before Christ. There is, unfortunately, much more to say about culpable ignorance, and that's what I'll be talking about most of the time. It often involves not wanting to know, or maybe I should say more powerfully, wanting not to know, leading to the denial of global warming, for example, or the denial of the Holocaust. But denial is also associated with another form of ignorance, that is, not wanting other people to know something. In other words, secrecy. At this point, some sociologists like to speak of what they call the construction of ignorance. Now, I define ignorance in a traditional fashion as the absence of knowledge. As you may well imagine, you can't construct an absence. So what they call the construction of ignorance, I prefer to describe as attempts either to create confusion or to keep people ignorant of what they already don't know. For example, in England in the 17th and 18th century, certain feminists, or maybe I should say proto-feminists, pointed out that men keep women ignorant deliberately by not letting them go to school, and that they do this so that they'll be able to dominate them more successfully. So that's, I think, a dramatic example of not wanting other people to know something. Well, I could go on making these distinctions, but I'd rather move on and deal with 3 important questions in order. In the first place, I want to ask, how can anybody write a history of ignorance? Because that means writing the history of an absence. Secondly, I want to talk about the disadvantages, or on occasion, the advantages of being ignorant of something. And finally, briefly at the end, I want to respond to the question, today, are we living in an age of knowledge or an age of ignorance? So I begin with the problem of method. While I was researching and writing this book, I had imagined a traditional common sense historian, what I would call an archive positivist, looking over my shoulder and saying again and again, what are the sources? How can you write the history of something that isn't there? There is, luckily, an answer to this awkward question. Direct sources are lacking, obviously, but it remains possible to approach the topic in an indirect manner, to study what we might call significant absences, and even sometimes conspicuous absences. In this way, the historian of ignorance resembles the detective Sherlock Holmes in a famous story by Arthur Conan Doyle about the dog that did not bark in the night. It's a story about the theft of a racehorse. And the detective discovered that when the thief came in the middle of the night and stole the horse, the guard dog did not bark. What could this absence of a bark signify? It obviously signified that the dog knew the thief. In other words, this was an inside job. And that led Sherlock Holmes once again to identify the culprit. So in the case of the history of ignorance, what indirect approaches are available? I'm going to distinguish three. In the first place, every new discovery reveals what was not known before. So, after Columbus made his landfall in 1492, people came to know that they had been ignorant of the existence of the New World, a fourth continent. And in similar fashion, the history of science could be written. I wish somebody would do this, or maybe it's my ignorance and somebody's done this already. But the history of science could be written backwards. So what we didn't know before Einstein, what we didn't know before Darwin, what we didn't know before Galileo, and so on. A second indirect approach is to compare different parts of the world. Theorists of education have created an interesting concept, which they call the null curriculum. That is, what is not being taught in a particular place and a particular time. Of course, to become conscious of what's not being taught, you have to look at other places where it's really on the curriculum. Now, take the case of philosophy. Philosophy has a leading place in final years in French lycée, in the German gymnasium, in the Italian liceo. When I discovered this, I became conscious of the fact that teaching philosophy is absent from English schools. I think that's a great pity. Nothing I can do about it, but I wouldn't even have become conscious of this had it not been for reading about other countries. And a third indirect approach to the study of ignorance is to focus on the consequences of this lack of knowledge. A few consequences are positive. We might call them benign, but I'm afraid that the majority of consequences are unfortunate. I begin with the positive side. In the 16th century, the French essayist Michel de Montaigne believed that illiterate peasants were much happier than well-educated gentlemen such as himself. In that sense, ignorance is bliss. Today, a common example of benign ignorance, of which I used to be reminded every year when it was my turn to mark exam papers, is that it's a very good idea not to know the identity of the student whose exam paper one is marking. It means one is much fairer. Even more important is the case of trial by jury. As you know, the jury at a major trial are isolated. They can't go home. Their smartphones are taken away from them. They're not allowed to see newspapers. They're not allowed to watch television. In other words, they can't have access to any outside reports on the trial which might distort their judgment. All they have to make up their minds is the evidence publicly presented in court. So, in that sense, justice is blind and fair because it's blind. A more difficult case, more controversial case, is the question whether the revelation of secrets by whistleblowers is a good thing or a bad thing. Many of us would like to see more transparency in government. On the other hand, it's surely a good idea that when major negotiations are taking place inside the country or between countries, the public should not know what's going on until a result has been achieved. In that way, there's not going to be any pressure on the people negotiating to make particular demands. Okay, so much for the positive side. Let me pass now to the many disadvantages, dangers of ignorance. It's something that the histories of business, politics, war, and epidemics makes very clear. So I'm going to take examples in what follows from those four fields, discussing them in order. In the case of business, or the economy in general, it's worth distinguishing several types of ignorance. I think at least four. The first is the ignorance of consumers who don't know about the defects of the products they're buying and may not know of alternative products that do a similar job. Second kind of ignorance, the ignorance of investors who may know nothing about the activities of the firms in whose shares they are investing. That raises moral questions, but it also raises questions of prudence. Not following the fortunes of the businesses in whom one is investing means that if they're in difficulties, the investors don't know about it. And a firm may go bankrupt, its shares go to rock bottom, people lose their life savings. It's an old story. The most famous British example is more than 200 years old. It's called the South Sea Bubble. That was when the term bubble was coined for shares which rise in price very quickly, expanding like a bubble, and then burst and fall to the floor. And like the crash of the stock market in New York in the year 1929, the story of the South Sea Bubble acts as a warning of the dangers of ignorance in the field of investment. And the last case is the study of ignorance in firms. If one wanted to study this in detail, there are, of course, records of bankruptcies. They show what the heads of certain businesses fail to know, especially ignorance of the potential market for their goods and services, which they overestimated, produced too much, couldn't sell, went bankrupt. Now, in the economic field, it's particularly obvious that ignorance is not confined to individuals. Business theorists have identified what they call organizational ignorance. The point is, as organizations become larger, and especially if they're hierarchical organizations, as many are, information does not flow easily, either upwards or downwards. It's obvious enough that in a big firm, the bosses know things that the workers don't. The bosses see the big picture, the place of their organization among its competitors. But in most cases, they see no need to share that knowledge with the other workers in the firm. And on the other hand, less obviously, it is the case that workers know things that the bosses don't know. They know and understand what they experience every day, the realities on the shop floor, in the office, and so on. But again, they see no need to share this knowledge with management. In short, the hierarchical system is a major obstacle to the communication of information between the top and the bottom. It might be facilitated by middle management, but it's not easy to find managers who would speak truth to power. That is, managers prepared to tell the boss what they think the boss needs to know but doesn't want to know. Imagine telling Stalin that his 5-year plan wasn't working. Who would be the first to do that? Now, mentioning Stalin brings us to politics. The essential problem might be summed up in a sentence. The ignorance of the public is an asset for authoritarian regimes, for dictatorships, but it's a liability for democracies. The ignorance of the public is an asset for dictators because the more people know about the regime under which they live, the more likely they are to criticize it. Staying with Stalin for a moment. Until the end of the USSR, cafes were extremely rare in Moscow. And telephone directories, printed telephone directories, were not available. I asked Russian friends why this was the case, and they said it was a decision by Stalin. His idea was if people met in cafes, they would say bad things about the regime. If people telephoned one another, they'd say bad things about the regime. Probably he was right. In any case, he tried to limit the damage by making it difficult to communicate. On the other hand, ignorance is a liability for democracies because ignorant voters may make unwise choices, may make choices which they will live to regret. For this reason, surveys of what is called voter ignorance have been carried out in a number of countries, especially the United States, but Britain as well. These surveys reveal the ignorance of many voters, up to a third of voters, about the policies favored by the candidates for whom they mean to vote. And they also reveal voter ignorance of international affairs, about which a future government may have to make very important decisions. And of course, the ignorance of the public is not just simple ignorance. It often includes not wanting to know. Take the case of German civilians during the Second World War. They tried to ignore the death camps that the regime had recently established. Some of them even tried to ignore the camps situated near their towns and villages, although many of these civilians could see, could hear, and could even smell what was going on. A situation dramatized in a well-known novel by Martin Amis about Auschwitz, a zone of interest, which was recently made into a film that you may have seen. So the ignorance of the public is dangerous enough, but still more serious in its consequences are the many ignorances of decision makers. Let me begin with an example from the Middle Ages and early modern times. Rulers were ignorant of the mood of the people. The problem was they were protected from that knowledge by the people surrounding them, their officials. Once again, the officials hesitated giving the ruler bad news on the principle that the ruler might decide to shoot the messenger. Awareness of this problem is recorded in folk tales. A recurrent European folk tale tells the story that the ruler one night decides to walk the streets of the city wearing a disguise, hoping to hear what the people really think about him and information that his officials don't dare to give him. The story is attributed to different rulers, to the Caliph Harun al-Rashid in medieval Baghdad, to King Henry VIII in London, and to Ivan the Terrible in Moscow. But the message is the same. And ignorance at the top is more common than we dare to think. Just to take recent examples, think of ex-President Trump and his imitator, ex-President Bolsonaro, of their cheerful dismissal of vaccines against COVID, for instance. Both men appeared and still appear to be ignorant of their own ignorance. And of course, in the case of the ignorance of rulers, whether they're democratic or not, we have to remember that they were never trained for the job, or very rarely. They can learn from experience, but they're often required to make instant decisions in areas where they have no expertise, from finance to foreign policy. In foreign affairs, a famous example of the unfortunate consequences of ignorance at the top was displayed at the peace settlement after the First World War at Versailles. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States and Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain were among the few people to redraw the map of Europe following the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. But they made these decisions with very little knowledge of Europe's geography. And again, as in the case of business, organizational ignorance is a major problem for governments. In the case of France, a pioneering sociological study was published about 60 years ago. It was based on interviews of the employees of a large government organization. And it quoted the interviewees who said their bosses were, I quote, too far above the actual work program to understand what is actually going on. So the employees were aware of the problem in their own organization. The sociologist generalized it, noting the centralization of power in any organization will inevitably produce what he called a blind spot. He summed up the situation in a memorable epigram. I quote, "Those who have the necessary information do not have the power to decide. But those who have the power to decide cannot get the necessary information." So research has gone on about organizational ignorance in business and in government. I believe that other institutions, ranging from the army to the church, and I'm afraid the university, all suffer from organizational ignorance of some kind. But as far as I know, no sociologist, no historian has yet made the decision to study them in this way. Lots of work to do in the future. Now I'm going to do something that originally surprised myself. I'm going to turn to the history of war. I must confess, I've never been a specialist on military history, but I discovered in the course of researching the history of ignorance that war offers particularly clear examples of its consequences. The point is, in war, ignorance is punished rapidly and visibly, especially in the case of battle, though it's in what has been called the fog of battle. Commanders on both sides are usually ignorant of what the other side are doing. Or in the famous phrase of the Duke of Wellington at the time of his conflict with Napoleon, what is going on the other side of the hill? That is, the general on one side is unlikely to know the size of the other army, its position, and finally, its resources. Is it well supplied with ammunition? Does the enemy have enough food? Matters which are crucial to the decision whether to attack or not, but the information is not available. So generals who won battles were simply the ones who were a little less ignorant than the generals on the other side. So I believe the concept of relative ignorance is crucial for understanding situations of conflict and competition, and not just in war. And in the case of war, awareness of one's ignorance is also important, because ignorance and arrogance make a fatal combination. They've led in war to underestimation of the enemy. Professional soldiers have often made this mistake when the enemy is not another professional for whom they might have some respect, but a group of amateurs, guerrillas. A sense of superiority has often led to defeat. I'm thinking, for example, of the French army in Indochina in the 1950s, not to mention the Americans in Vietnam in the 1960s. Of course, these defeats were not the result of a simple absence of knowledge, though this absence played its part. I think that the French and American generals were in denial. They did not want to know that the enemy was well trained, did not want to know that the morale of the enemy was high, did not want to know that the defenders knew the terrain much better than the invaders. Of course, this situation is repeating itself in the Ukraine today. A dramatic series of examples of military disaster of this kind comes from the history of Afghanistan. I choose these examples because they show the risks run by leaders who are ignorant of history. As you know, historians are often challenged to say, what's the use of knowing about the past? I've often been asked this. My favorite response is to turn the question upside down and say, it's easier to point out the disasters that follow not knowing about the past, because it's easier to demonstrate that than the opposite. So take the case of 3 invasions of Afghanistan. All of them went wrong for the invaders. The most recent one was the American invasion of the year 2001. Its predecessor was the Russian invasion of 1979. But there was a much earlier invasion, the British invasion of Afghanistan in the year 1839. In the case of that first invasion, organized by the powerful East India Company, the British Army was completely wiped out on its retreat through narrow mountain passes. The commander should have known, but obviously did not know, that it was necessary to command the heights of these passes before marching through. He was also ignorant of the fact that the firearms used by the Afghans had a longer range than the firearms used by the British. As a result, the Afghan guerrillas were able to occupy the heights and safely fire down on the British until they'd killed everybody. This disaster might have served as a warning to later invaders, but it didn't. After the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the British Foreign Office presented a visiting Russian minister with a history of the British invasion. I'm afraid that the minister didn't seem to be very grateful. His rather gruff response was simply, "This time it'll be different," but it wasn't. Finally, 12 years ago, the Scottish historian William Dalrymple published his history of the British-Afghan War, in which he drew parallels between the British invasion and the American one. Soon after his book was published, Dalrymple was invited to Washington to brief national security, the CIA, and defense on the history of Afghanistan. Finally, Americans had become aware of the cost of their previous ignorance. Well, turning now to the history of epidemics, I think it's illuminating to place COVID as the latest in a series of major pandemics. In chronological order, bubonic plague in Europe and Asia between the 14th century and the end of the 17th, smallpox in Europe and the Americas between the 16th and the 18th century, cholera in the 19th century, and the so-called Spanish flu in the early 20th century. In each case, when the epidemic struck for the first time, nobody knew where it came from, nobody knew how it spread, nobody knew how to resist it. As a result, many lives were lost before the necessary knowledge was acquired. On occasion, measures that had been adopted to counter the plague actually had the opposite effect of spreading it. A famous Italian historian, Carlo Cipolla, wrote a book about the plague in Tuscany in the 17th century, pointing out that the religious services that had been organized to ask God to stop the plague spread it by means of contagion. Crowds of people standing close to one another, infecting one another. And a major consequence of ignorance in epidemics is panic, and the consequence of panic is the need to find human scapegoats for what's going on. During the bubonic plague of the 14th century, rumors spread that the Jews were responsible, that they'd been poisoning the wells. And as a result, from Spain to Germany, in major cities, crowds attacked the Jewish quarter. Later on, thanks to the great novel by Alessandro Manzoni, you'll remember that during the Great Plague in northern Italy in 1630, especially in Milan, many people believed that the deaths were the result of a conspiracy by the so-called untori. People claimed that they'd seen other people painting the walls of the city with poison and spreading the plague in this way. Unfortunately, replacing ignorance and false knowledge is a process that has had to be repeated in the case of each new pandemic. During COVID, conspiracy theories surfaced yet again. Some Americans believed that COVID had been spread by the Chinese, but on the other side, some Chinese believed that COVID had been spread by the American army. Now, returning to the question I haven't discussed yet about keeping other people ignorant, I want to say something now about cover-ups. The public has often been kept ignorant of certain sensitive matters by the deliberate concealment of information that might embarrass either a particular company or a particular government. As you know, some of these cover-ups have been revealed by whistleblowers. In the case of industry, think of the stories about the connection between tobacco and lung cancer and the way in which this knowledge had been hushed up by the tobacco companies. Something similar in the case of industrial pollution, and something similar more recently about pharmaceuticals that were launched on the market while keeping the public ignorant of potential dangers from side effects. Even more common are political cover-ups. To take a notorious example, think of the explosion at the nuclear power station in Chernobyl in 1986. At the time, the Soviet government remained silent about the disaster, and later on, it denied it. What makes this episode rather ironic is that this happened in 1986 at the beginning of Gorbachev's policy of transparency, glasnost. It may have been effective in other domains, but it certainly was not effective in the case of this cover-up. The first news outside the Soviet Union came from Sweden 3 days after the accident, when scientists noticed that local radiation had increased at an alarming rate. Now, it's time to move to my third and final question about changes in the situation over the long term. Are we more or less ignorant than our predecessors? Certain periods in the past have often been described as ages of ignorance, or more picturesquely, ages of darkness. During the Enlightenment, of course, the Middle Ages was seen as the Dark Ages. And Muslims speak of the period before Muhammad as the age of ignorance, in other words, ignorance of Islam. But what about our own time? I've often been asked this question. Do we know more or less than our ancestors? Maybe you'd like to guess how I'm going to answer. What I always say, annoyingly, is yes and no. Because on one side, humanity as a whole has never known more than it does now, thanks to the accumulation of research. But if we look at individuals, they don't seem to know more, or certainly not much more, than their ancestors, because our knowledge is limited by the number of waking hours at our disposal, which hasn't changed much, if at all, over the centuries. And the consequences of this simple fact is that if we know more about something, we've got less time to know about something else. Today, a younger generation has often acquired new kinds of knowledge of the online universe, that older generations still lack. But the price of that knowledge is increasing ignorance of much that older generations took for granted as necessary knowledge. Knowledge of the Bible, knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome and their history, philosophy, knowledge of literary classics such as Dante or Shakespeare. So, and there's another problem, a very serious problem, which can be described in terms of a paradox. The rapid increase of information in our time leads to what has been described as information overload. And in its turn, information overload leads to ignorance. Let me distinguish at this point between information and knowledge. When I use the term information, I'm thinking of data that are relatively raw. When I talk about knowledge, I'm talking about data that has been cooked. In other words, it's been processed. The processes include classification, verification, and so on. Now, if information increases at a very rapid rate, there isn't enough time to select what's important. There isn't enough time to test its accuracy, and so turn it into knowledge and to communicate it to other people. While the intellectual workers are still working on one wave of information, another wave has already upon them. Take the memorable and tragic case of 9/11. It seems clear now that the American Secret Services were aware in advance of the possibility of an imminent attack by terrorists on American soil. They sent the government warnings, but these warnings were overlooked They were lost among the huge numbers of reports that the American government received every day. Afterwards, Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time, when she was asked to explain the apparent failure of intelligence on that occasion, she simply remarked, I quote, "There was a lot of chatter in the system." In other words, too much information, not enough time to make a good selection. In short, there is a good case of describing our time as an age of ignorance as well as an age of knowledge. If there's a lesson to be drawn from this story, it's a lesson of humility. As an American humorist, probably Mark Twain liked to remark, I quote, "We are all ignorant just about different things." With those wise words, I conclude. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you. My watch.
Grazie tantissimo. Abbiamo imparato un sacco da una lezione sull'ignoranza, il che è meraviglioso. Thank you, Peter. Abbiamo un po' di minuti per dialogare con Peter. Come sempre, BergamoScienza, avrei un sacco di domande, ma la priorità va alle domande dal pubblico e poi se riesco ne faccio ancora qualcuna io. Abbiamo il microfono che gira. Eccolo qua, in prima fila.
Grazie infinite per questa lezione. L'ovazione del pubblico è d'accordo con me. La mia domanda è questo. Praticamente, avendo io un'età avanzata, ho vissuto una realtà da bambino diversa da quella che vivono oggi i bambini. E la differenza che io vedo è che mentre noi imparavamo praticamente con i nostri giochi anche di imitare gli adulti, oggi invece i bambini imparano praticamente da internet con tutte le tecnologie moderne, considerando che, come avete detto voi, l'ignoranza e la conoscenza sono come due alberi gemelli che crescono allo stesso modo. Vorrei che ci chiarisse, se possibile, se è meglio l'età, diciamo, di 80 anni fa rispetto a quella di oggi. Grazie.
Fate domande più sintetiche perché io non sono un interprete professionista, quindi
So,
the
can you
question
give
is
me a very short version of that?
yeah, the question is about the different kinds of learnings that we can say with respect to the latest three generations. So
Yeah.
in the previous generations, we learned a lot about games or
Yeah.
practical games. Now we learn a lot about digital devices and so on. Do you think this could be a kind of new ignorance or a progress, or what do you think about that? This change of ways of learning?
I think it's an old story, but it's become much more serious. The more rapid cultural and social change occurs, the more dramatic the distance between the generations is going to be. So, yes, sons have long thought of their fathers as ignorant and vice versa. Still, more dramatically the case when it's grandfathers, as I'm too well aware. But the amount of knowledge that most people had did not change very fast before the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And the process has been increasing in more or less in geometrical progression. So it's something we have to worry about more and more. Yeah. Yeah.
Ok, altre domande? C'è una qua, una signora in terza fila, qua sulla destra.
Noi oggi abbiamo a disposizione la scuola per combattere l'ignoranza. Cosa, secondo lei, è indispensabile insegnare e soprattutto come dobbiamo insegnarlo?
This question is about school as the great enemy of ignorance. So the question is, what do you think is essential to teach in school today in order to defeat ignorance and the damages of ignorance?
Yeah. That's a nice big question that when one thinks about the variety of subjects that are taught in schools by different professors. Let me start with history, because I used to teach history, and simply say the younger generation, whether they like it or not, are citizens of the world, so that they have to be prepared for this by at least some classes in global history. It's not sufficient, as it used to seem, to teach the history of one's own nation. I think an ideal history curriculum, if only there were enough time, which there probably isn't, would be to have an element of local history, an element of national history, an element in Europe of European history, and an element of world history. I realize that that's a big ask at a time when I think the number of hours in a school in a week that are devoted to all the humanities is shrinking, but that would be my ideal. And in other subjects, I think to try to find equivalents of what is absolutely essential to know in our rapidly changing world, which means reviewing the curriculum at short intervals rather than longer ones.
Altre domande? C'è il microfono già? C'è una domanda qui all'estrema destra al palco, seconda fila. Dalla parte opposta. Alzate la mano, se no non vi vede là vicino all'uscita. Ecco.
Grazie. La mia domanda è: come dovrebbe gestire la società l'aumento della privatizzazione delle informazioni? Tipo, mi viene in mente Elon Musk, che ha recentemente acquistato Twitter, facendo diventare X, ma in generale proprio dell'informazione privatizzata, anche telegiornali, giornali, che possono venire utilizzati come propaganda anche a livello personale. Penso ad esempio ai guru dell'informatica, che sembrano essere arrivati dal nulla, quando spesso e volentieri, tipo Musk, ha fatto la sua fortuna con le miniere di smeraldi di suo padre. C'è una sorta di manipolazione delle informazioni a favore delle stesse persone, ma anche delle idee che hanno. L'informazione non dovrebbe essere un pochino più indipendente?
So the question in this case is about the fact that what do you think about how society and politics should deal with the increase of privatization of information, with few owners of information platforms like Elon Musk and Google and so on. So what do you think about this fact, this oligopoly of information with dangers of manipulation, propaganda, and so on today?
There are so many ways in which the circulation of information has been blocked, and we certainly don't need more of them. As I said before, I'm a bit ambivalent about all forms of transparency. I think the amount of transparency in government in most countries could certainly be increased, and the amount of transparency in the interactions between big firms and their customers could easily be increased. That would be to everybody's advantage, or maybe at least to the advantages of the majority of the population. But I don't believe in complete free trade in information. I think that there are special circumstances in which some operations should be kept secret, at least for a time, above all in wartime, but in other situations of crisis in the case of government. So I have to say I need to give a rather mixed response.
Mhm. Allora, ci sono 2 domande, no, 3, ok. Le avete viste? Ecco, prego.
Volevo chiedere, quando si è fatto il confronto fra il passato e oggi sulla quantità di informazioni che abbiamo, appunto, si è parlato del fatto che le informazioni sono cambiate. Una volta si conosceva Dante a memoria, oggi conosciamo altri autori, altre conoscenze, eccetera. Ecco, però ok, fino a quando si parla del mondo intellettuale, okay, penso che sia impossibile controbattere, insomma, è abbastanza evidente questo concetto. Mi chiedevo invece quando si parlava del mondo più povero, contadino, per esempio. I contadini fino al 700 passavano 12 ore al giorno a zappare la terra e, ok, per quanto tempo potessero dedicare a questa attività, di certo non acquisivano nuove informazioni zappando in maniera diversa rispetto al giorno prima. Perciò mi chiedevo se questa cosa che le informazioni che abbiamo sono sempre rimaste le stesse, se sia vero a livello solo di società o anche a livello delle varie fasce di popolazione. Quindi se magari non è che una certa fascia di popolazione adesso è diventata, come dire, meno ignorante, o se anche per tutte le fasce di popolazione c'è stato semplicemente un cambiamento.
Faccio una sintesi, poi vediamo se è corretta. In this case, the question is, your social and cultural history could be applied only to the elite of the society, where, of course, there's a lot of information that can be shared and transmitted, or in your case, do you think the same model that you apply could be also useful for poor people that until very recent time had no knowledge at all, so they were completely unliteracy? So how can you apply your ideas to the lower classes of the society?
I still haven't followed that properly.
Because you said, okay, in the next age, every age consider the previous age as an age of ignorance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is true just for the elite or also for the other classes of the society? I hope to be intended correctly the question. Anyway.
Yeah, actually, I don't think it's the case that every age has considered its predecessors an age of ignorance. In the early Middle Ages, I think people look back to the past as a time when people knew more than people knew in the present. But it's true, this is a recurrent situation, especially since the 18th century, that people in the present are sure that they know more, understand more than people in the past. And to some degree, that was just hubris. They were an unjustified self-confidence and lack of awareness of areas in which earlier people knew things that the people in the present didn't know or don't know. So I do distrust the very clear scheme which used to be so dominant in Europe in the 19th and early 20th century, that we, with a capital W, knew more, and that they, that is, dead people, but people also in other parts of the world, knew less than us. The more research has been done, the more it's clear that, let's say, a so-called primitive people in the Amazon has all sorts of knowledge of animals and plants that nobody in Europe has, and so on. So I go back to, I think, Mark Twain continues to be right about us all being ignorant, but just of different things.
Le ultime due veloci, voglio solo aggiungere rispetto a questa risposta che nel suo lavoro si occupa molto anche della conoscenza tacita, no? Quella non letteraria, scritta, ma per esempio i contadini hanno tante conoscenze, no? Tramandate, pratiche, manuali, anche quella è conoscenza, ovviamente è informazione. Abbiamo tempo solo per due domande ancora, qui ce n'è una, dipende da dove vanno i microfoni, non vi vedo, eccovi, vai.
Per cortesia, perché l'alfabetizzazione di massa che si sperava potesse dare una spallata a questa malattia endemica dell'ignoranza, poi di fatto non ha portato a tutti i risultati sperati, anche con la crescente divulgazione scientifica di cui BergamoScienza è un esempio? Grazie.
So the question is, why? What do you think about the fact that mass literacy that we have today was unable to defeat ignorance? So, what about the mass literacy, the effect of mass literacy? BergamoScienza is an example of science literacy. So, what do you think about that?
I have to say I don't know very much about this in any level of detail, but I was much impressed by the work of an American historian of science, Peter Burke, who wrote an article just a few years ago about the extent to which governments, including democratic governments, are hiding more and more information than ever before. So instead of a rise of transparency, we should be talking about a rise of opacity, making it more difficult for everybody except a few insiders to understand the world we live in. I think this is a very worrying trend, and it seems to be happening on quite a large scale.
Benissimo. Posso aggiungere anche che da molte indagini fatte recentemente, se voi andate a vedere il livello di istruzione media della parte della popolazione, anche in Italia, che si oppone alla scienza e che ha posizioni antiscientifiche, hanno un titolo di studio che è superiore a quello della media degli altri italiani. Questo è piuttosto controintuitivo e deve farci riflettere che il titolo di studio non è un antidoto per pensare sciocchezze. Quarta fila lì. Ah no, c'era... Ok, veloci, poi c'è anche questo signore che da tempo che aspetta, quindi le ultime due veloci, vai.
First of all, thank you very much. I would like to
Grazie,
ask you about...
bravissimo.
Okay. I would like to ask you about one famous line that you mentioned before, ignorance is bliss. About this, I wanted to ask you if you really think that maybe knowing less could lead us to live a better life, or this greater knowledge could lead to live a sadder life. For example, I'm talking about some phenomenon that happened in the past but is still occurring today, like the Blue Whale Challenge for the social media, or also our capacity to buy things, since I came to know that looking at the past, since our wish list grew longer, our, let's call it shop list, grew shorter by the time.
Did you grasp it? Did you grasp the question?
No, I didn't get any of it.
Devi sintetizzarla in una frase sola. Si vive meglio più ignoranti? Posso dirla così? So the provocative question is, in the case, like in the case of infodemia and the excess of information, so maybe it should be better to live with less knowledge in some cases, or not? So less knowledge, so more ignorant, or not? Or
If only we could select which knowledge not to know and which to know, but you need to know everything to make a good selection. So I think it would be wonderful if we could do this, but I don't see any way that it could be possible.
l'ultima qua, signore? C'era prima lui, chiedo scusa, ma il professor Burke è qui, quindi poi potete fargli tutte le domande che volete. Quel signore con... Sì, alzi la mano.
Allora, volevo porre questa domanda. Siccome la storia, diciamo, avanza per gradi, nel senso che man mano che anche gli archivi di Stato e in particolare chiaramente la desecretazione, diciamo, di segreti di Stato dà la possibilità agli storici di poter, diciamo, rivedere la rappresentazione della realtà storica, io mi chiedo, e con riferimento all'Italia, anche perché lei è uno storico inglese, gli inglesi spesso hanno avuto una visione molto lucida della storia italiana, più di quanto l'abbiamo noi, almeno secondo quello che poco che conosco io. Per esempio, che tempi ci vorranno per cui, chiedo scusa se può essere un po' polemica la domanda, per cui il mito del nostro risorgimento e tutto quello che si racconta sulla storia che semplicemente dei 1000 avrebbero conquistato il Sud Italia, io sono uno del Sud, si sente dalla voce, o comunque anche tutto il resto del periodo fascista, ma anche post-fascista, democratico, repubblicano, tutti i segreti che ancora devono essere disvelati riguardo alle stragi. Insomma, la domanda alla fine è questa: si accorceranno secondo lei i tempi in cui verranno desecretati atti che possono essere utili per gli storici, o in futuro questo spazio di tempo aumenterà? E quindi perché in tal caso tanti miti, tante false rappresentazioni della realtà su come nasce anche uno Stato o comunque su come una classe o un particolare partito politico diciamo riesce a mantenere il potere, cioè non ci vengono date spiegazioni su questo aspetto qui, chiedo scusa.
Okay, so it's a question connected to the fact you, historians like you, use national archives, and national archives have a period of secretation, and then we can open them and use the information within the national archives. So what do you think about could be useful for you to shorten this period of secret for the national archives? And you know very well the Italian history, so what do you think it will be the impact of opening these national archives for crucial parts of Italian history, like Risorgimento, or the birth of Italian state, or other periods of our story? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, if I've understood rightly, archives could be organized in such a way as to give information not only to scholars but to a wider range of clients. I know somebody, a Dutch archivist, who has the idea, now that so much of the archive is available electronically, that he could imitate the methods that he used elsewhere and say, if you show interest in this, maybe, then you should consult the following other files that you don't know about. And that would make research much more democratic. You wouldn't have to have a doctorate before you even go into the archive. I should say that this is, I think his voice is still a minority among the archivists that I've encountered. Let's hope he wins. Yeah.
Ok, All'inizio del lavoro del libro di Peter Burke c'è una citazione che mi sembra perfetta per concludere questo incontro. Se pensate che l'educazione e la scienza siano costose, provate con l'ignoranza, vedrete quanto vi costerà quella. Grazie a Peter Burke.
Thank you. Thank you.